In psychology, there is this thing called the late onset of illness. And in the medical science, there is a thing called withdrawal symptoms. It comes down to the following. When someone is using drugs, whether it's crack, as you see in the background of this video, or it is some other substance they are addicted to. Once they've been using the substance for a while, the body has become attached to the substance. The hormonal balance of the body is disturbed. So now the body processes the external substance as part of the natural function of the body, even though it shouldn't be like that. So the moment the drug addict stops taking that substance or stops using that substance, the body is confused. So now the imbalance that was there in the body all along will become visible. Because it was a substitute substance in the body kept functioning despite the dysfunction. But once the addict cannot get his high or her high anymore, now the dysfunction becomes visible. So now they'll be sweating, they can't sleep, now they have headaches, so now they can't function at all anymore in daily life. Until they get their shot again. Now, what does this have to do with the late onset of illness? The late onset of illness comes down to the following. Let's say there's a car accident. Everyone that was involved in the accident, well, not really involved, but you have the driver, the two drivers, you have children in the cars, and you have witnesses that saw it. Let's say everyone that was related to the car accident. Let's say that the accident happened in 2015. And none of the people had any side effects. They just went on with living, going to work, or doing their hobbies, or they were going on holiday, so things just continued as usual. But 10 years later, in 2025, one of those people who was shocked by that accident now has nightmares. She cannot think straight. She has a high heart rate. What's going on? She experienced an intense shock when she witnessed that car accident. Her mind could not process it at the time. Her body was also shocked. So both her mind and her body went into a shock. That shock was repressed by the body. And the mind built a small bubble around the memory. So, because this happened, she didn't collapse at the time. So she could continue to function. So that was the short-term advantage of this bubble that was generated in her mind and this repression that happened in her body. However, that does not mean that she is healthy. That's why years later, now that shock shows up, because that shock was there in the body all along. So now the shock resurfaces. And because she has forgotten about the car accident, she doesn't know why she's feeling so shocked. And in her mind, the memory now pops up and she has flashbacks. That's a delayed onset of illness. You can say that any addiction is part of the late onset of illness. Now, I'm not saying that everyone that had a car accident becomes a drug addict. I didn't say that. Just listen to what I'm saying here. Because I'm using this as a parable to understand things about the spirit world and also how things work out there in society. Just like in psychology, you have a delayed onset of illness. As in the medical world, you have withdrawal symptoms when someone can't access the substance of their addiction. The same it is spiritually and with the human population as a collective. Because worldly people operate in a fallen mind. So worldly people have a narcissistic outlook on things. They have a black and white thinking. That's how they are. And because they have this black and white thinking, they have this clinging onto control. and this clinging onto control is addictive. So worldly people, they generate mental addictions. And some of those mental addictions will work out in physical addictions. In case someone becomes addicted to cocaine, heroin, or whatever it is. Some people don't get physical substance addictions, but they get activity addictions. For example, sex addictions. Or you have sport addictions. Or you have work addictions, where someone becomes a workaholic. Listen what I'm saying, there is no such thing as a good addiction. Because an addiction is a dysfunction. And the addiction is only hindering symptoms that something needs to be addressed. So let's go back to the example I gave on to you. Someone experienced a car accident, but they didn't process it. Now over time they begin to feel very tired. So now they begin to take some pills just to keep functioning. Eventually they become addicted to those pills. They can't even function anymore without those pills. What's going on? There were symptoms manifesting of the shock she experienced. And those symptoms were showing that she was about to collapse mentally. Now, that collapse has been delayed by her taking all those pills. But those pills added to the problem because now she also has an addiction to deal with. Not only does she have to do with post-traumatic stress, but she also has to deal with the emotional side effects of being addicted to pills. So, a delayed onset of illness often goes hand in hand with addiction. And as long as there is supply for the addiction, you won't notice how bad the situation is. It's only when the supply of the addiction is cut off that you will see the dysfunction or the defect for what it really is. Now, what does this have to do with the spirit world? Just think about it for a moment. Let's say now, I'm going to give a context, because remember what I said in my previous videos. All behavior happens within a context. And it's behavior that drives situations and circumstances. So situations and circumstances are manifestations of a context. So let's say now, okay, let me give a situation, then I give you the context. Let's say that you have some manager at a bank who applies for a job in Brussels because he wants to work at the European Investment Bank. He wants to make a step in his career. He's in his 40s, so he thinks it's the right time. Now he has the experience and he can get the job. But then they want to do a background check. It's a regular thing they do. He got the job already, but they still have to do a background check just in case. Then they find out that he worked at a restaurant during his college years. But now that they try to get some references from that job, they can't get any. Some say, well, it's 20 years ago, 2 decades, which is true. But the people in Brussels think it's quite weird someone works somewhere for 4 years, but nobody can remember them. It is as if the restaurant erased any trace that this man ever worked there. And this restaurant was not just a McDonald's or a Wendy's or some Starbucks. It was a luxurious restaurant in a financial center of London. So, why would such a prestigious restaurant not want to admit that someone works there that later had a good career? I mean, if the man turned out into a criminal, then I could understand that you don't want to be associated, you want his name to be associated with your business. But this man had a prestigious career afterwards. So why would they want to erase the fact that he ever worked there? So that's the situation. And the situation is a manifestation of the context. Now, in a situation, it's a behavior, this denial. People are avoiding acknowledging that the man ever works there. Now, let's look at the context now. The context is that while this man was in his early 20s and he worked there, he became the target of psychic rage. But because he was such a good employee, they couldn't just fire him. They hoped he would disappear by himself, so they wouldn't have to explain why they fired him, because they couldn't fire him, because he was doing his job well, but he became the target of psychic rage. Sooner than they thought, all the psychic rage backfired on them. They expected that soon the guy, being stressed out after he finished college, he would turn into a drug addict, or he would get some 9-to-5 job which would tire him more. So they expected bad things to happen to him, because they were projecting onto him. When he got a job as a manager of a local bank, and that was also the bank where that restaurant had its account, and it's also the bank where the employees there had their accounts, they were shocked, because the man they perceived to be a loser, the man they perceived to be a troublemaker, that man now had a leverage over them, far more than he had when he worked at that restaurant. So this is what happened. Those people were projected onto him at the job, and also outside of it, they were dependent on this psychic relief of looking down on this man. Let's call this man Robert. Yes, I know I use such names often, but okay, you get this. This is a parable. So, because they were so comfortable and used to dumping psychic violence on Robert, when Robert escaped their violence and Robert was not affected nor harmed by their violence, and not only that, Robert also thrived despite their violence, when this manifested, it became a big embarrassment onto them. Because now they had to face the leverage of this Robert, while they didn't even want to admit he exists. So now Robert had more influence, and they had no choice but to deal with this influence. So what happened now? They couldn't dump on Robert anymore. So now they had to face their own internal issues. But they never learned how to face their internal issues. So, when they couldn't dump on Robert anymore, many of them became violent, or they became delusional, they had hallucinations, so they had withdrawal symptoms. And now, all of their youth traumas, or childhood traumas, all of their family dysfunctions became visible. So there was an onset of illness that was delayed further by them using Robert as a scapegoat. The moment Robert was not available as a scapegoat anymore, and the moment Robert's influence backfired their psychic violence, they had no supply anymore to cover up the onset of illness that was working out. So, that restaurant went through a crisis. Eventually, the restaurant received a new owner, and it received a new staff, and the new owner, as well as the new staff, knew what happened before, but they just didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want to address it. That's why now, that 20 years later, even though it's 2 decades, the consequences of all that resistance against Robert is still felt by the community, but none want to address it. In this case, there was a delayed onset of illness collectively. There was a lot of dysfunction in the community, and this delayed onset was further delayed by scapegoating. But this could only continue as long as there was supply. So as long as there were victims, everyone was at ease. The moment there wasn't a victim available, their defects, their dysfunctions, and the evil that was established in that community manifested. They couldn't hide anymore. It became into their face. And what happens when defects, dysfunctions, and worse, evil of a community becomes so open that nobody can deny it anymore? What happens then is that either that community self-destructs instantly, due to a civil war or due to escalation of domestic violence here and there, or the community is, how would I say, the community is kept virtually alive, but there is no real social bond anymore between the people of that community. Or there's another possibility, if it's not a very big community like a big society, like if it's not a community as, for example, an ethnicity of 1 million people, or if it's just a very small community, they can just dissolve the community. So if it's a corporation, they can dissolve the corporation, for example. Just realize that in this world, much of the social dynamics you see can only continue as smooth as it is due to paranormal aid. And the way this paranormal aid works is that the illness of the community is delayed from manifesting. And that's done through distractions. And to make these distractions work, people are selected as victims and they are charged with violence by that group. And they are blamed for their own victimization. Those people didn't victimize themselves, but they are blamed by the community that victimized them. Why this happened? Because as long as there are quote-unquote pathetic people around them, as long as there are lazy troublemakers around them, as long as there are people that they can victimize, they don't have to face the deep-rooted dysfunctions, defects, nor evil that's going on in the community. So, ask yourself the following. Whenever you see some dysfunction openly in a community, what is the history of this dysfunction? Or what's the history of this defect? Is it a new issue that emerged due to some terrorist attack or due to some crime that happened? Or is it an old issue, maybe a transgenerational issue, an issue that happened an issue that started a few generations before, that's now manifesting in full? Just as a drug addict faces withdrawal symptoms when they don't get a supply of the substance they're addicted to, society begins to fracture and people tend to lose their minds when there isn't narcissistic supply for them to be relieved. And the same as someone can have a delayed onset of illness when they experience something very shocking, very traumatic, the same way a community or a nation or an ethnicity can experience a delayed onset of generational curses from something that happened maybe 100 years ago or 200 years ago. But it doesn't matter that it happened so long ago. What matters is that the community never healed collectively of what happened. They never processed it. And because they never processed it, it began to haunt them as a community, and unconsciously they began to transfer the consequences of that shocking event onto their children. So now the children grew up, they didn't know any better, so they were transferring the same to their children. And that's how it can happen, that you have a shocking thing that happens, for example, in the late 1700s, and in the 1980s, it escalates. And when the escalation happens, people only look at the actors of today. They only look at the people that are alive today through whom the violence works out. But they don't look at the historical context, how it came into being. Because when you look at the historical context, you realize, oh, okay. There is this small civil war going on here, but this conflict didn't start in the 1960s, though to some division of labor by the corporate world, even though this is what triggered the escalation, but it's not that division of labor by the corporate world that caused this conflict. This conflict goes back all the way to the late 1790s, to the colonial era. And the people of this community throughout all that time never processed what happened. And the people that live today don't even know exactly what happened, but they're still carrying the consequences of what happened. So now they need to be delivered from what happened back then, so they won't haunt them in the future. So, just because something happened so long ago doesn't mean that people today will not experience any side effects of it. Some of you who are listening to this video, you've been experiencing side effects, or better said, after effects of things that happened generations ago. Something that happened to your ancestors. It can be it was slavery, or it can be that it was satanic ritual abuse, or it can be that it was genocide. I don't know what it is. But there were things that happened a long time ago. Not that long ago, maybe past century, or past 2 or 3 centuries. Especially if it's something that endured. If it's just one event, okay, it's just one event. But if it's a series of events, if it's a chronological evil or chronological dysfunction or defect that continued in a community for more than 2 generations, it can be that you today are reaping the full harvest of violence as a consequence of this generational dysfunction. Is that your fault? Did you cause it? No, but you need to acknowledge what's going on for you to be delivered from it. That's what you ought to look for, deliverance. You can't fix the past. Nobody asks you to fix the past because you can't do it. So that's not what it's about. It's about you acknowledging what's going on, examining the context, and you are wise as a serpent. You're seeking deliverance. You're dealing with whatever's going on in a constructive and beneficial manner. The reason why transgenerational violence continues is because people want to flee. They want relief. So there's a delayed onset of illness, collectively sponsored and fueled by scapegoating. And mainstream media has its role in this. So whatever's going on around you, don't just look at today. Look at the historical context. When you examine the historical context, you'll see what's going on far better, and you'll see far better ways to deal with the context behind the situation in a constructive and beneficial manner without harming yourself in the process. Because when you are fleeing all the time, you'll harm yourself in the long run. When you're fleeing from stuff, eventually you'll hit a wall. And it will be very unpleasant and rude when you experience that hitting the wall. But you will face it if you keep fleeing. So deal with things in a constructive, beneficial manner, because that's how you glorify Christ. Well, understand that there are no quick fixes when it comes to the spirit world. There are no quick fixes when it comes to societal ills. Societal ills, that means dysfunctions, defects, and sometimes evil in society or evil in human communities. There are no quick fixes for it. You'll need to process it, and if a community wants to heal and be better, they need to process it collectively also. Well, that's it for now. Keep agreeing with Christ and be at peace.